the unconscious from emerging. Good night.
In 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire led Europe into war. As the horror mounted, Freud saw it as terrible evidence of the truth of his findings. The saddest thing, he wrote, is that this is exactly the way we should have expected people to behave, from our knowledge of psychoanalysis. Governments had unleashed the primitive forces in human beings, and no one seemed to know how to stop them. At that time, Freud's young nephew, Edward Bernays, was working as a press agent in America. His main client was the world-famous opera singer Caruso, who was touring the United States. Bernays' parents had emigrated to America 20 years before, but he kept in touch with his uncle and joined him for holidays in the Alps. But Bernays was now about to return to Europe for a very different reason. On the night that Caruso opened in Toledo, Ohio, America announced it was entering the war against Germany and Austria. As a part of the war effort, the US government set up a Committee on Public Information, and Bernays was employed to promote America's war aims in the press. The President, Woodrow Wilson, had announced that the United States would fight not to restore the old empires, but to bring democracy to all of Europe. And Bernays proved extremely skillful in promoting this idea, both at home and abroad. And at the end of the war, he was asked to accompany the President to the Paris Peace Conference.
Then, to my surprise, they asked me to go over with Woodrow Wilson to the peace conference. And at the age of 26, I was in Paris for the entire time of the peace conference that was held in the suburb of Paris, and we worked to make the world safe for democracy. That was a big slogan.
Wilson's reception in Paris astounded Bernays and the other American propagandists. Their propaganda had portrayed Wilson as a liberator of the people, a man who would create a new world in which the individual would be free. They had made him a hero of the masses. And as he watched the crowd surge around Wilson, Bernays began to wonder whether it would be possible to do the same type of mass persuasion, but in peacetime.
When I came back to the United States, I decided that if you could use propaganda for war, you could certainly use it for peace. And propaganda got to be a bad word because of the Germans using it. So what I did was to try to find some other words. So we found the word Council on Public Relations.
Bernays returned to New York and set up as a public relations counsel in a small office off Broadway. It was the first time the term had ever been used. Since the end of the 19th century, America had become a mass industrial society, with millions clustered together in the cities. Bernays was determined to find a way to manage and alter the way these new crowds thought and felt. To do this, he turned to the writings of his uncle Sigmund. While in Paris, Bernays had sent his uncle a gift of some Havana cigars. In return, Freud had sent him a copy of his general introduction to psychoanalysis. Bernays read it, and the picture of hidden irrational forces inside human beings fascinated him. He wondered whether he might make money by manipulating the unconscious.
I should show you a documentary on...
What do you think?
I know there's actually a connection with the Portugal case of, what's her name? I forget the child's name that was kidnapped, but anyways, the Podesta brothers and their connection to the grandson of Sigmund Freud, which is interesting. His house was literally a quarter mile down the street from where the little girl was kidnapped. All the people that were interconnected, the eyewitnesses, and how the Podestas and Hillary Clinton were all involved. Even Anthony Weiner. They were literally cannibals, but how they actually did excavation in the back of property of this mansion, and Sigmund Freud's mansion. He's dead now, but it was bequeathed to his grandson, obviously. And the day they went there to go excavate it, lawyers got involved, obviously, and they had to wait a day for the warrant. And by the time they got there the next day,
everything was gone.
No, the backyard was freshly dug up and everything like that. But the cadaver dogs actually did pick up a scent of corpses. Even the cadaver dogs within the room picked up the scent of corpses. from the person whoever kidnapped the girl. Actually, they themselves smelled like death, which is crazy.
These people
And
are evil.
the Podesta brothers, John Podesta and Tony Podesta. So these two were actually seen in Portugal. Anthony Weiner was there too. They were only there for one night and then left. Interestingly enough, they had like the sketches in Portugal, right? They look identical to the Podesta brothers look like. So then there was a leaked video. But anyways, what's trippy is that one of the 10 children that John Podesta has adopted, which are obviously sex trafficked children, one of the kids has the same eye marking as the same girl that got kidnapped from Portugal. Same blonde little girl with like a black dot on her left pupil. Very interesting, right? Of course, nothing's going to get done until Juice comes back and destroys them all, but I just want to fill you in on this whole Sigmund Freud bloodline. Piece of crap.
This idea that there is a lot more going on in human decision making, not only among individuals, but even more importantly among groups, than this idea that information drives behavior. And so Eddie began to formulate this idea that you had to look at things that would play to people's irrational emotions. And you see, that moved Eddie immediately into a different category from other people in his field and most government officials and managers of the day who thought if you just hit people with all this factual information, they would look at that and say, oh, of course. And Eddie knew that was not the way the world worked.
Do you get that? So,
yeah.
So at the beginning, right? So he's talking about how Sigmund Freud was. This is what we actually. This is all like backed up. Sigmund Freud's ideas were not that popular even in Vienna. Okay, he was considered a failure because he couldn't become part of the intellectual elite at the time, of Habsburg Vienna, because they were all Catholics. Okay, so they were living by, like that whole traditional Catholic kind of, ethos was, humans are rational people and we're going to try to live by that, by the highest, um, nature of a human person. Now, there's a lot of discipline involved. There's a lot, yeah, it's strict. You get what I mean? There's a lot of hypocrisy for obvious reasons, but so the prevailing attitude, right, during like this particular time was you had to try to be a rational, respectable person, fact orientated, right? But Edward Bernays is like, no, let's not try to appeal to that. Let's try to appeal to people's most basest, irrational, like fears and emotions, right? Because that's what basically Sigmund Freud's whole thesis was that at the heart, based on his own psychoanalysis and studies, when you start asking people to start sharing their feelings, what he found was that people are motivated by two things: sex and fear. That's Freud's whole thesis, right? So then Edward Bernays, who's his nephew, right, starts looking into this, and you can see how, he's over here in the United States. So this is going to go through it all. Like, so
Bernays set out to experiment with the minds of the popular classes. His most dramatic experiment was to persuade women to smoke. At that time, there was a taboo against women smoking, and one of his early clients, George Hill, the president of the American Tobacco Corporation, asked Bernays to find a way of breaking it.
He said, we're losing half of our market because men have invoked the taboo against women smoking in public. Can you do anything about that? I said, let me think about it. And then I said,
oh shit!
to see a psychoanalyst.
Is it the real Nephilim?
Find out what cigarettes mean to women. He said, what'll it cost? So I called up Dr. Brill, A.A. Brill, who was a leading psychoanalyst in New York at that time.
How come you didn't call your uncle? Why didn't you call your uncle?
Because he was in Vienna.
Nephilim.
A.A. Brill was one of the first psychoanalysts in America, and for a large fee, he told Bernays that cigarettes were a symbol of the penis and of male sexual power. He told Bernays that if he could find a way to connect cigarettes with the idea of challenging male power, then women would smoke, because then they would have their own penises.
Virgin can.
New York held an Easter Day parade to which thousands came, and Bernays decided to stage an event there. He persuaded a group of rich debutantes to hide cigarettes under their clothes. Then they should join the parade, and at a given signal from him, they were to light up the cigarettes dramatically. Bernays then informed the press that he had heard that a group of suffragettes were preparing to protest by lighting up what they called torches of freedom.
That's right.
We're watching a video.
Would be there to capture this moment. And so he was ready with a phrase, which was torches of freedom. And so here you have a symbol, women, young women, debutantes, smoking a cigarette in public with a phrase that means anybody who believes in this kind of equality pretty much has to support them in the ensuing debate about this, because torches of freedom. I mean, what's on all American coins? It's liberty. She's holding up the torch. You see? And so all of this is there together. There's emotion, there's memory, there's a rational phrase, even though it's using a lot of emotional elements. It's a phrase that works in a rational sense. All of this is together. And so the next day, this was not just in all of the New York papers, it was across the United States and around the world. And from that point forward, the sale of cigarettes to women began to rise. He had made them socially acceptable with a single symbolic act.
That's crazy,
What
man.
Bernays had created was the idea
People are
that if a woman smoked,
NPCs.
it made her more powerful and independent. An idea that still persists
Well,
today.
maybe if smoking cigarettes wasn't so cool.
It made him realize that it was possible to persuade people to behave irrationally if you link products to their emotional desires and feelings. The idea that
There you
smoking
go.
actually made women freer was completely irrational, but it made them feel more independent. It meant that irrelevant objects could become powerful emotional symbols of how you wanted to be seen by others.
Eddie Bernays saw the way to sell product was not to sell it to your intellect, that you ought to buy an automobile, but that you will feel better about it if you have this automobile. I think he originated that idea, that they weren't just purchasing something, but they were engaging themselves, emotionally or personally, in the product or service. That it's not, you think you need a new piece of clothing, but you'll feel better with the piece of clothing. That was his contribution in a very real sense. We see it all over the place today, but I think he originated the idea of the emotional connect to a product or service.
What
Mad
Bernays
men.
was doing fascinated America's
All
corporations.
buying and selling decisions, man.
They had
It's
come
all
out of the war
emotions.
rich and powerful, but
These
they had a
people are
growing worry.
NPCs.
The system of mass production had flourished during the war, and now millions of goods were pouring off production lines.
Like, these are our
What they were
grandparents.
frightened
These are our
of was the danger
parents.
of overproduction,
You get what I mean?
that there would come a point when people had enough goods.
Maybe our.
I think
this
it's
is our
worse
great
today in a way.
grandparents.
Oh
Up
yeah.
until that point,
That's
the
what
majority
this
of
this
products were
this
still sold to
series
the
is
masses
gonna
for-
cover up everything all the way up to the 2000s, and then there's like
What about the 2020s?
yeah. There's it isn't part of this same series, but there are people that have. So, the guy who like really picks this whole idea up about engineering of consent is Noam Chomsky. So I don't agree with Noam Chomsky's politics, but I agree with his analysis, his political theory.
What do you think about his spiritual bullshit?
Are you talking about Noam Chomsky?
I think so. Hold on, let me see. Or
Yeah.
no, I'm thinking about Deepak Chopra. Never
Oh,
mind.
no.
Different
Okay.
guy.
Yeah.
on the basis of need. While the rich had long been used to luxury goods, for the millions of working-class Americans, most products were still advertised as necessities. Goods like shoes, stockings, even cars were promoted in functional terms for their durability. The aim of the advertisements was simply to show people the product's practical virtues, nothing more. What the corporations realized they had to do was transform the way the majority of Americans thought about products. One leading Wall Street banker, Paul Mazur of Lehman Brothers, was clear about what was necessary. We must shift America, he wrote, from a needs to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things, even before the old have been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality in America. Man's desires must overshadow his needs.
Prior to that time, there was no American consumer. There was the American worker, and there was the American owner, and they manufactured and they saved, and they ate what they had to, and the people shopped for what they needed. And while the very rich may have bought things they didn't need, most people did not. And Mazur envisioned a break with that, where you would have things that you didn't actually need, but you wanted, as opposed to needed.
And the man who would be at the center of changing that mentality for the corporations was Edward Bernays.
Bernays really is the guy within the United States more than anybody else who sort of brings to the table psychological theory as something that is an essential part of how, from the corporate side, of how we are going to appeal to the masses effectively. And the whole sort of merchandising establishment and sales establishment is ready for Sigmund Freud. I mean, they are ready for understanding what motivates the human mind. And so that there's this real openness to Bernays' techniques being used to sell products to the masses.
Beginning in the early 20s, the New York banks funded the creation of chains of department stores across America. They were to be the outlets for the mass-produced goods, and Bernays' job was to produce the new type of customer. Bernays began to create many of the techniques of mass consumer persuasion that we now live with. He was employed by William Randolph Hearst to promote his new women's magazines, and Bernays glamorized them by placing articles and advertisements that linked products made by others of his clients to famous film stars like Clara Bow, who was also his client. Bernays also began the practice of product placement in the movies, and he dressed the stars at the film's premieres with clothes and jewellery from other firms he represented. He was, he claimed, the first person to tell car companies they could sell cars as symbols of male sexuality. He employed psychologists to issue reports that said products were good for you, and then pretended they were independent studies. He organised fashion shows in the department stores and paid celebrities to repeat the new and essential message: you bought things not just for need, but to express your inner sense of yourself to others.
There's a psychology of dress. Have you ever thought about it? How it can express your character? You all have interesting characters, but some of them are all hidden. I wonder why you all want to dress always the same, with the same hats and the same coats. I'm sure all of you are interesting and have wonderful things about you, but looking at you in the street, you all look so much the same. And that's why I'm talking to you about the psychology of dress. Try and express yourselves better in your dress. Bring out certain things that you think are hidden. I wonder if you've thought of this angle of your personality.
I'd like to ask you some questions. Why do you like short skirts?
Oh, because there's more to see.
More to see, eh? What good does that do you?
Looks at my hands. It makes you more attractive.
Yes?
In 1927, an American journalist wrote, "A change has come over our
They're a bunch of hoes, dude.
Always, man, always.
democracy. It is called consumptionism. The American citizen's first importance to his country is now no longer that of citizen, but that of consumer." The growing wave of consumerism helped in turn to create a stock market boom. And yet again, Edward Bernays became involved, promoting the novel idea that ordinary people should buy shares, borrowing money from banks he also represented. And yet again, millions followed his advice.
He was uniquely knowledgeable about how people in large numbers are going to react to products and ideas and so on. But in political terms, if he were to go outside, I can't imagine that he could get 3 people to stand and listen. Wasn't particularly articulate, was a kind of funny looking, and didn't have any sense of reaching out for people one-on-one. None at all. He didn't think about people in groups of one, thought about people in groups of thousands.
I would have nothing to do with it. Hello?
Bernays soon became famous as the man who understood the mind of the crowd. And in 1924, the president contacted him. President Coolidge was a quiet, taciturn man and had become a national joke. The press portrayed him as a dull, humorless figure. Bernays' solution was to do exactly the same as he had done with products. He persuaded 34 famous film stars to visit the White House. And for the first time, politics became involved with public relations.
And I lined up these 34 people, and I'd say, "What's your name?" He'd say, "Al Jolson." I'd say, "Mr. President, Al Jolson." The next day, every newspaper in the United States had a front page story: President Coolidge entertains actors at White House. And the Times had a headline which said, "President nearly laughed." And everybody was happy.
But while Bernays became rich and powerful in America, in Vienna his uncle was facing disaster. Like much of Europe, Vienna was suffering an economic crisis and massive inflation, which wiped out all of Freud's savings. Facing bankruptcy, he wrote to his nephew for help. Bernays responded by arranging for Freud's works to be published for the first time in America, and began to send his uncle precious dollars, which Freud kept secretly in a foreign bank account.
He was Freud's agent, if you will, to get his books published. Well, of course, once the books were being published, Eddie couldn't help himself but to promote these books, see that everybody read them, make them controversial, emphasize the fact that, do you know what Freud says about sex and what he says cigarettes are a symbol of and so on and so forth? How do you suppose all those stories got out? Certainly the academics weren't spreading these around the country. Eddie Bernays was. Then, when Freud became accepted, well then, of course, to go to a client and say, well, Uncle Siggy, see, then that had some cachet. But notice there, first Eddie created Uncle Siggy in the U.S., made him acceptable, secondly, and thirdly, then capitalized on Uncle Siggy. Typical Bernays performance.
Bernays also suggested that Freud promote himself in the United States. He proposed his uncle write an article for Cosmopolitan, a magazine that Bernays represented, entitled A Woman's Mental Place in the Home. Freud was furious. Such an idea, he said, was unthinkable. It was vulgar, and anyway, he hated America. Freud was now becoming increasingly
Why did he
pessimistic about
America,
human beings.
dude?
In the mid-20s, he retreated in the
That's how
summers
Germans
to the
are.
Alps, sometimes
Oh, yeah.
staying in an old hotel, the Pension Moritz in Berchtesgaden. It is now a ruin. Freud began to write about group behavior, about how easily the unconscious aggressive forces in human beings could be triggered when they were in crowds. Freud believed he had underestimated the aggressive instincts in human beings. They were far more dangerous than he had originally thought.
After World War I, Freud was basically a pessimist. He felt that man is an impossible creature, a very, very sadistic and bad species, and did not believe that man can be improved. Man is a ferocious animal, the most ferocious animal that exists. They enjoy torturing and killing, and he didn't like man.
The publication of Freud's works in America had an extraordinary effect on journalists and intellectuals in the 1920s. What fascinated and frightened them was the picture Freud painted of submerged, dangerous forces lurking just under the surface of modern society. Forces that could erupt easily to produce the frenzied mob which had the power to destroy even governments. It was this they believed had happened in Russia. To many, this meant that one of the guiding principles of mass democracy was wrong, the belief that human beings could be trusted to make decisions on a rational basis. The leading political writer, Walter Lippmann, argued that if human beings were in reality driven by unconscious, irrational forces, then it was necessary to rethink democracy. What was needed was a new elite who could manage what he called the bewildered herd. This would be done through psychological techniques that would control the unconscious feelings of the masses.
And so here you have Walter Lippmann, probably the most influential political thinker in the United States, who is essentially saying that the basic mechanism of the mass mind is unreason, is irrationality, is animality. He believes that the mob in the street, which is how he sees ordinary people, are people who are driven not by their minds but by their spinal cords. The notion of kind of animal drives, unconscious instinctual drives lurking beneath the surface of civilization. And so they started looking towards psychological science as a way of understanding the mechanisms by which the popular mind works, specifically with the goal of figuring out how to understand how to apply those mechanisms to strategies for social control.
Edward Bernays was fascinated by Lippmann's arguments, and also saw a way to promote himself by using them. In the 1920s, he began to write a series of books which argued that he had developed the very techniques Lippmann was calling for. By stimulating people's inner desires and then sating them with consumer products, he was creating a new way to manage the irrational force of the masses. He called it the engineering of consent.
Democracy, to my father, was a wonderful concept, but I don't think he felt that all those publics out there had reliable judgment, and that they very easily might vote for the wrong man or want the wrong thing, so that they had to be guided from above. It's enlightened despotism in a sense. You appeal to their desires and their unrecognized longings, that sort of thing. That you can tap into their deepest desires or their deepest fears and use that to your own purposes.
And then, in 1928, a president came to power who agreed with Bernays. President Hoover was the first politician to articulate the idea that consumerism had become the central motor of American life. After his election, he told a group of advertisers and public relations men, "You have taken over the job of creating desire and have transformed people into constantly moving happiness machines. Machines which have become the key to economic progress." What was beginning to emerge in the 1920s was a new idea of how to run mass democracy. At its heart was the consuming self, which not only made the economy work, but was happy and docile, and so created a stable society.
Both Bernays and Littman's concept of managing the masses takes the idea of democracy and it turns it into a palliative. It turns it into giving people some kind of feel-good medication that will respond to an immediate pain or an immediate yearning, but will not alter the objective circumstances one iota. I mean, democracy really, the idea of democracy at its heart was about changing the relations of power that had governed the world for so long. And Bernays' concept of democracy was one of maintaining the relations of power, even if it meant that one needed to sort of stimulate the psychological lives of the public. And in fact, in his mind, that was what was necessary. That if you can keep stimulating the irrational self, then leadership can basically go on doing what it wants to do.
Bernays now became one of the central figures in a business elite that dominated American society and politics in the 1920s.
When the first thing they say is,
he also became
well, why
extremely
doesn't
rich
God
and lived in a
have
suite of
a
rooms
potential?
in one of New York's
Who
most
was the
expensive
one that
hotels,
moved him?
where he gave frequent parties.
I mean,
oh my goodness, he had a home in the corner suite of the Sherry Netherland Hotel. And here's this wonderful suite with all these windows looking out on Central Park and across at the plaza and on the square. And he would use this place to hold a soiree. The mayor would come, all the media leaders would come, the political leaders, the business leaders, the people in the arts. I mean, it was a who's who. People wanted to know Eddie Bernays because, you know, he himself became a sort of a famous man, a sort of a magician who could make these things happen.
He knows everybody. He knows the mayor and he knows the senator and he calls politicians on the telephone as if he did get literally a high or a bang out of doing what he did. And that's fine. But it can be a little hard on the people around you, especially when you make other people feel stupid. People who worked for him were stupid, and children were stupid, and if people did things in a way that he wouldn't have done them, they were stupid. It was a word that he used over and over and over, dope and stupid.
And the masses?
They were stupid.
All right, what are you watching?
But Bernays'
Century of the
was about
South.
to be destroyed dramatically.
Everybody's stupid.
And by a type of human rationality, he could do nothing to control.
Everybody's stupid?
At the end of October 1921,
Everyone's
Bernays
stupid.
organized a huge national event to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the invention of the light bulb.
What does that
President
mean?
Hoover, the leaders of major corporations,
Everyone is
John D. Rockefeller,
stupid.
were all summoned by Bernays to
That
celebrate
sounds
the
awful.
power of American business. But even as they gathered, news came through that shares on the New York Stock Exchange were beginning to
Can I
fall.
just give a quick shout out to Times New Roman?
Yep. Yeah, you can do that.
Throughout
Hey,
the
shout out to
1920s,
Dan
speculators
Video.
had borrowed billions
Yo,
of dollars.
Dan Video makes the
The
best
banks
damn
had
video.
promoted the idea that this was a new era.
Shout
and market
out.
crashes were a thing of the past. But they were wrong. What was about to happen was the biggest stock market crash in history. Investors had
that thing I
panicked
was gonna
and begun to
say?
sell with blind, relentless fury that no reassurance by bankers or politicians could halt.
You know, like...
And on the 29th of October 1929, the market collapsed. The effect of the crash on the American economy was disastrous. Faced with recession and unemployment, millions of American workers stopped buying goods they didn't need. The consumer boom. Bernays
Well,
had done
I've
so
heard
much
two
to engineer
different
disappear.
ways. Maybe y'all can
He, in
explain what's the
professional
difference
public
between
relations, felt
the head.
Bernays' brief moment of power seemed to be over.
Wait. No, we're going to need a straight unmute on ISP. No.
The effect of the Wall Street crash on Europe was also catastrophic. It intensified the growing economic and political crisis in the new democracies. In both Germany and Austria, there were violent street battles between the armed wings of different political parties.
I'm going to make it 3,
Against this
2,
backdrop, Freud, who was suffering from cancer of the jaw, retreated yet again to the Alps. He wrote a book called Civilization and Its Discontents. It was a powerful attack on the idea that civilization was an expression of human progress. Instead, Freud argued, civilization had actually been constructed to control the dangerous animal forces inside human beings. What was implicit in Freud's argument was that the ideal of individual freedom, which was at the heart of democracy, was impossible. Human beings could never be allowed to truly express
Bismo.
themselves
Yeah.
because it was too dangerous.
What do you think Freud got wrong?
That human nature is not fundamentally our rational attitude, but like the will to power, like sex and fear. That's what Freud got wrong, in my opinion.
What
This
do you
video
think?
is gonna take you through this because this is literally this is the foundation, and then it's gonna go all the way up to the year 2000, basically. But go ahead.
What do you think? Freud should have if you could have told like if you could have like red pilled him on one thing like a lot like for psychology that would have made his philosophy or his this perspective more efficacious for understanding the human mind. Like, what do you think that thing was? Like, what do you think he was missing?
Freud was an academic. So, psychoanalysis uh, is a theory of the mind that tries to, its inductive premise is that the mind can only be explained through material causation. That's just the scientific premise for everything, right? That their approach to the quote unquote problem of the mind, so to speak, is to assume that it's not a transcendental or metaphysical thing. So every thought that we have have to have some sort of empirical correlative to it. And that's why he's saying when people are talking about love or when they're talking about what they want to do, like I want to get a house, I don't I don't know, Mr. Sigmund, I've been working to like get a house and try to buy this and try to buy that, and I'm just kind of lost because I don't know why I'm doing this. Sigmund Freud is going to diagnose and be like, okay, well, you want a house because I'm assuming that, you want to get married at some point, right? Are you in a, relationship right now? And he's like, no, not right now. I'm, trying to date, but I'm not good at talking with girls and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, well, when's the last time like you had sex? You know what I mean? Those are the kind of questions he's going to ask. There was a girl in here earlier when I was asking her, like, no, it was like yesterday, I'm sorry. Or was it earlier today? I don't fucking remember. When I was asking, um, like I was asking her what she wanted at the end of the day, right? Like, what do you find existential about marriage, right? So, I don't think that's like too off the boat to ask about those things because those are like real tangible material things even before we start idealizing about what a marriage should be. In a Catholic context, we're going to say, well, we're going to stick by certain truths about marriage that we're trying to live up to morally speaking, like monogamy and the vow that you make to each other in front of God. That's not the same thing as like the material conditions that allow for it. But if you're considering a psychodynamic where people aren't like living literally in heaven, we're like living here on earth, then yeah, questions about like the material reasons why we do things matter. Now, do I think that fundamentally people are driven by, sexual desires or just irrational fear? I don't believe that that's the case. I believe that if we want to,
Do you think it's a gross oversimplification?
yeah, definitely. I want to have hope. You know what I mean? I want to have, like, I think people are motivated more by like some purpose. My standpoint is I don't think most people know what the hell that they want. And I think the reason why religion is useful for society is because it can encounter you wherever you're at, shine a light on all the bad stuff that you're doing, and clarify for you what you should be doing instead. And through that process, you could actually find a purpose in life, find something to desire. I don't think that without religion or Western civilization, so to speak, I don't think people know what they want. And that's why it's so easy for people to get manipulated by people like Edward Bernays advertising the madmen of the 1960s, social justice issues during the 90s and 2000s, it's because people don't know what the fuck they want. And it's
Yeah.
easy to just have that dictated to you and to just go with the crowd. Remember
Do
when
you
we're all
think they want
teenagers? Yeah.
acceptance?
I don't even think it's that. I don't think it's I think it's people are looking for a false sense of security. Yeah. If you want to look at acceptance as providing security or what it's an illusion of security, because when you're part of a group, you lose your identity. But wasn't the whole point to like retain who you are as an individual?
Like for example, like I know I've already beat this horse a bit, but this is a very good one. It's like that, like the thought that is getting dicked down by 1,000 men. Like there is nothing. I can't imagine there being anything fulfilling. There, like that is just like a purely delusional, hedonistic thing, and it's like I'm breaking the world record.
I don't think it's about the sex. I think the
Yeah,
sex is a means to the end of accomplishing something.
yeah,
And for someone to get to that point where they're like, oh, as long as I'm accomplished something, I don't care what it is, even if it's getting dicked down by like 1,050 dudes. They just
yeah,
want to have something. You know what I mean?
yeah,
It's it could only be because they don't know what the fuck they want. They're just like,
yeah.
I didn't know what I wanted. I'm here anyways. It worked for me. I need to make some meaning out of it because I wasn't able to, create that on my own. Hey, look at me, everybody. I can fuck 1,000 guys in one day or in 12 hours.
Crazy.
Like that whole chain starts because they don't know what the fuck they want. They don't know what they want. They don't know what they should desire, so therefore they don't know what they want.
Yeah.
They must always be controlled, and would thus always be discontent.
Man doesn't want to be civilized, and he is civilization brings discontent, but it's necessary to survival. Otherwise, he couldn't survive. So he must be discontent, because this would be the only way to keep him within limits.
But what did Freud think about the idea of the equality of man?
He didn't believe in it.
We had 32 parties, and Hitler said, before those parties don't vanish, there is no Germany. That's true. You can't have 32 parties. And so they felt, this one person will put an end to this comedy.
Freud was not alone in his pessimism. Politicians like Adolf Hitler emerged from a growing despair in the 1920s about democracy. The Nazis were convinced that democracy was dangerous because it unleashed a selfish individualism, but didn't have the means to control it. Hitler's party, the National Socialists, stood in elections, promising in their propaganda that they would abandon democracy because of the chaos and unemployment it led to.
Die Parteien versprachen den Himmel auf Erden.
In March 1933, the National Socialists were elected to power in Germany, and they set out to create a society that would control human beings in a different way. One of their first acts was to take control of business. The planning of production would in future be done by the state. The free market was too unstable, as the crash in America had proved. Workers' leisure time was also planned by the state through a new organisation called Strength Through Joy. One of its mottos was service, not service.
So this is the important thing. This is the linkage between Freud and Nazi socialism.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, yeah, Democrats, like in today's world, they don't believe in the individual. They don't believe in equality through freedom, right? Meaning, hey, we're going to value everybody's individual freedom, God-given freedom, and so you're equal and you get to choose whatever you do. This doesn't necessarily mean equality in outcome. In Freud's worldview, we're not equal because we're not naturally equal. Democracy is not possible as an ideal. Therefore, the state should engineer people and tell them what to do. It's a form of command theory without the king.
Yeah.
People who like to LARP around as if, oh, well, the Nazis were under attack from all these religious and the Jews and all this stuff, they just want control. They want social control because their fundamental belief is that we are not equal.
Yeah.
But the Nazis did not see
So,
this as a return to an
at the end of the day, Nazi socialism, I don't believe it's a right-wing idea. It's the leftist idea. It's a very pessimistic view of human nature. And if you look at the liberals today, that's how they are. But they have to use this kind of marketing tactic to try to convince people at that irrational level rather than using their reason. Like, because if you use reason, you say it's objective, then you go, oh, okay, logic is objective, the natural law is objective, therefore we have free will. Free will only follows if the highest part of a quote unquote anthropology is your rational faculty. That's why in St. Thomas's system, when it comes to the question of do the angels have reason? Yes, they do. They have a higher reason and knowledge than we do. Do they have free will then? Yes, they do. Because reason gives the ability for you to entertain two or more different alternative possibilities. So
Yeah.
we have freedom and we're equal in that regard, but we may not be equal given our particular condition or circumstances. The moral task is to choose the best choice given our set of circumstances and
Yeah.
areas. And we should empower people to make the right choices rather than dictate what those choices are to them. Sorry.
An old form of autocratic control. It was a new alternative to democracy, in which the feelings and the desires of the masses would still be central, but they would be channeled in such a way as to bind the nation together. The chief exponent of this was Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda.
Es mag gut sein, Macht zu besitzen, die auf Gewehren ruht. Besser aber und beglückender ist es, das Herz eines Volkes zu gewinnen und es auch zu behalten.
Goebbels organised huge rallies whose function, he said, was to forge the mind of the nation into a unity of thinking, feeling and desire. One of his inspirations, he told an American journalist, was the writings of Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays. In his work on Crown Psychology, Freud described how the frightening irrationality inside human beings could emerge in such groups. The deep, what he called libidinal forces of desire, are given up to the leader, while the aggressive instincts are unleashed on those outside the group. Freud wrote this as a warning, but the Nazis were deliberately encouraging these forces because they believed they could master and control them.
So
And
what
they
Edward,
did, right?
so if you heard, we're gonna go back, okay?
Yeah. We play it.
Goebbels, right, who was the propaganda minister of the Nazi Reich, he was writing back and forth with Edward Bernays. That's where Goebbels got all of his ideas. Because that's literally what they were trying to do in Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
This is the link. I don't believe Edward Bernays was part of the Nazi Party in America, but the Nazi Party in America were Freudians.
Mind of the nation into a unity of thinking, feeling.
They didn't believe in democracy. They were literally like fight. They were moles in America. That was like democracy is sucks. Democracy is run by all the Jews. You see what I mean? Because they want to diffuse and take our fucking power away.
And desire. One of his inspirations, he told an American journalist, was the writings of Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays. In his work on Crown Psychology, Freud described how the frightening irrationality inside human beings could emerge in such groups. The deep, what he called libidinal forces of desire, are given up to the leader, while the aggressive instincts are unleashed on those outside the group. Freud wrote this as a warning, but
So
the Nazis
Freud-
were deliberately encouraging these forces because they believed they could master and control them.
Goebbels was trying to do what Edward Bernays was doing in America, and he was trying to nationalize it.
Well, Freud was saying that masses are bound by libidinal forces. They love each other and delegate their ideas and their feelings to the chap on top.
What are libidinal forces? What are libidinal forces?
12 forces of love.
Not hate.
No, hate is delegated to the others outside.
Hate is delegated to those that are outside of the group. It's crazy.
It's the mob.
Actually, wait, pause it. So I'm sure like you've probably seen these things, but one of this kind of goes back to your point about how like the left kind of utilizes that concept, because one of my other buddies in a different server, he's not like the most political guy, but like he told his family during a Thanksgiving type thing, like, oh yeah, I'm voting for Trump, right? And not many people really cared. However, his sister, this guy's like 40 something, and he has a kid, and his sister's like around the same age. His sister's like the polar opposite politically, and she was so upset about like the fact that he was voting for Trump that she like cut that bridge, like that familial bond over like that political difference.
Yeah.
Like basically, like it's like if you're not with us, you're literally like the enemy, even if you're family. And it just kind of goes back to this, like weaponizing hate towards the external forces,
Right.
or the other people
Those
that
who
aren't
don't
here.
love the same ideas that you do.
Yeah.
The left doesn't care about reasoning through their own fucking ideas. They don't care if it's circular. They don't care if it's irrational to have men play in women's sports. They're in love with that idea. It's new, it's novel, it's the new shiny object. It's something that they identify with to get social status. It's an easy way out that's provided by them, by society, by guess who? The people who want to fucking control us.
Yeah.
So we have the elite still use these tactics because it works. It's all part of their social engineering. That's what the CIA is involved in. That's what these globalists are doing to us right now. They're feeding us easy ideas, and they're just trying to create a voting base out of it to get their own person into power. Because they already know that the majority of the people don't have a way of escaping their current circumstances. So they feed the stupid people a love of an idea like transformerism, excuse me.
Yeah.
And they say like, if you love this idea, and they're going to spend all this money in advertising, even if it doesn't make them any money, it doesn't turn into profit. But the reason why they're doing it is because they're going to gain political power by selling off their company profits. To have the companies
Yeah.
that they do own keep just do a bunch of fucking commercials and sell this, whether it's Disney or Gillette or Budweiser. They're all owned by companies who are or by people, by moneyed interests that have bought into these companies and control them at this point, that are trying to spread a political ideology. Because they're trying to create a mass like programming of consent to give people the opportunity, the people who tend to be more emotional than rational, to just
Yeah.
choose the easy way out. Oh, what I believe is just as valuable as yours, but I can prove that mine is better because I can prove to you how loyal I am to the idea and how much I love my idea. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's why they always go, how can you love Trump? How can you love, someone who's so selfish?
Yeah.
It's all this moral argumentation that they have. It's all emotionally driven. And anyway, sorry. So like it feeds their own love or their own, self-identification with this idea that they've chosen to like love. Their hate against everybody else that doesn't love the same thing that they do. Anyways.
I could see from afar, looking up Wilhelmstraße towards Unter den Linden, how those 100,000 of people, when they passed Hitler, They just became completely delirious. They began to shout these cries I will never get out of my ears. Heil, Sieg, Heil. They demented. And here I got confirmation how those irrational forces, uncontrollable forces in Germany, in the Germans, had erupted, had broken out, were running riot, were departing, marching on.
I think one thing that this probably isn't gonna do too. There is probably a level to where this has like a useful effect just by itself. You know, before Hitler, before the Third Reich and all this shit happened, like Germany was like a fucking. It was in hyperinflation. It was absolute dog water. To live there, and he completely like turned it around. So like, I think that would it'd give it like a double, like a two times effect. Like I don't think that this would have worked as well. Like all this Freudian stuff, the Bernays stuff would have worked if like the if they were still in hyperinflation and the country was still fucking broken.
That's a that's an interesting way to look at it.
And in America too, democracy was under threat from the force of the angry mob. The effect of the stock market crash had been disastrous. There was growing violence as an angry population took out their frustration on the corporations who were seen to have caused this disaster. Then, in 1932, a new president was elected who was also going to use the power of the state to control the free market. But his aim was not to destroy democracy, but to strengthen it. And to do this, he was going.
So I wasn't going to spoil it for you, but it's interesting that that this comes to your mind because you're right on track. So Edward Bernays does his thing, and then the depression does happen, and then you'll see what happens.
Going to develop a new way of dealing with the masses.
I am prepared, under my constitutional duty.
FDR, the Democrat grandfather,
to recommend the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. But in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power.
Do you see the similarities between America and Nazi Germany?
Yeah.
That's what happened after the Great Depression. We did the same thing the fucking Nazis did with the Democratic Party. They are the Nazis in America.
Why didn't we rely more on like private institutions? Like I don't know if you would call like the church a private institution, but
that's what Ayn Rand was trying to reintroduce into American libertarianism to fight this FDR New Deal.
I think this would have been more. I think this would have been like this would have put us in like the better timeline. I think if like if you couldn't afford to go to the regular privatized hospital, maybe you go to one that's like affiliated with like a church, and you fucking they cut like they foot that bill, and then you put like some time into it, right? Like, or maybe you don't, but like the idea of like these public
yeah, I mean that's always existed near and far. I'm not sure how much you know about like that's what the whole abortion debate has been about. The left is trying to push it because they're literally trying to attack Catholic hospitals. So if you know anything like financially how it's set up and how it works, the reason why private hospitals, they do get subsidies from the government. So the reason why the left wants to mandate abortion care is because they want more bureaucratic influence within the private institutions. Because once you mandate it and now the hospitals are forced to provide abortifacient care, then that adds more money into into the private hospital system, if you get an influx of people that want abortions at your hospital, but your hospital, even though you're Catholic and you've been subsidizing, you've been able to keep costs low because you are taking government subsidies, and now you have people showing up that want abortions, they're allowed by government insurance to basically have, pay you as an institution to get that abortion done, and the government saying that you can't deny us from paying you for her to have an abortion, then they're going to have another regulatory body determining what the hospital can and cannot do. That's how complex and sophisticated it's kind of gotten in our circumstance. So I get where your sentiment is, right? Like, we're way beyond that at this point. That's all I have to say. Like,
do you think it's too late to return?
Yeah,
with,
it's too late. It's too late.
With the capital V, return to,
It's too
like a
late.
tradition or something?
Nope. It's too late. Like, that's why it's so relevant. When you look at what's happening with the Vatican, dude, and we were talking earlier today about like the homosexuals have already taken over the Catholic Church. Nobody cares, dude. You know what I mean? The people that could care and do something about it, they don't care.
They're gay.
Yeah, they're gay. That's why I wanted to go through this, is because you can see how early this kind of like self-centered way of looking at the world and only wanting to feed everybody's individual like desires, where that comes from.
Yeah.
And it happens literally before the Second Vatican Council. So you have a whole generation of people that are already like this even before the Second Vatican Council happens. And then they turn over the tradition of the church to this new crowd way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
So,
what do you think?
Bismo, what do you think? Keep talking. He was cooking.
Yeah, he was cooking.
Let's continue. This part's important. You'll see.
It was the start of what would become known as the New Deal. Roosevelt assembled a group of young technocrats and planners in Washington. He told them that their job was to plan and run giant new industrial projects for the good of the nation. Roosevelt was convinced that the stock market crash had shown that laissez-faire capitalism could no longer run modern industrial economies. It had become the job of government. Big business was horrified, but the New Deal attracted the admiration of the Nazis, especially Joseph Goebbels.
Do you see?
Yeah.
It's this exact question you asked, which was, I mean, in a different timeline, could it have been private industry, right, that would have been able to fix it instead of this, like, mass propaganda machine or engineering of consent from both our government and from big corpa? The answer is we tried. But the Democrats in America with FDR went down the complete other philosophical route. And the current Democrats now are no different from FDR, fundamentally speaking. It's the way Nancy Pelosi thinks. It's the way that Gavin Newsom thinks. It's the way that what's his face up in Canada thinks. It's the way Barack Obama thinks. It's the way Biden thinks about all these issues. This is the way that Jerome Powell thinks, the head of the Federal Reserve. It's all the fucking liberals. Tim Cook at Apple, this is how he thinks. So FDR convinced that laissez-faire capitalism can no longer handle modern industrial economies.
Become the job of government.
The government has to direct this.
But the New Deal attracted the admiration of the Nazis, especially Joseph Goebbels.
This is going to come around in full circle and get much more sophisticated when they get to the 80s and stuff.
Dass Präsident Roosevelt und seine Berater auf dem richtigen Wege sind. Es handelt sich in der Tat das
This is all before World War II. And you have like literally Goebbels saying that he agrees with FDR and the New Deal. And so the Nazi Party in Germany tried to do the same exact thing.
Die vielen Millionen Arbeitslosen, die ihre Plätze an den Maschinen und in den Kontoren verloren haben, wieder an ihre alten Arbeitsstellen zurückzuführen. Das kann nicht allein der privaten Initiative überlassen werden. Ausschlaggebend ist, dass die öffentliche Hand mit positiven Maßnahmen eingreift.
But although Roosevelt, like the Nazis, was trying to organize society in a different way, unlike the Nazis, he believed that human beings were rational and could be trusted to take an active part in government. Roosevelt believed it was possible to explain his policies to ordinary Americans and take into account their opinions. To do this, he was helped by the new ideas of an American social scientist called George Gallup.
Favorite reading of New Deal Washington, the survey of U.S. public opinion. From offices at Princeton, New Jersey, a famed statistician, Dr. George Gallup, tells Washington from week to week what the nation is thinking. And in New York, Fortune magazine's analyst Elmo Roper compiles...
So you've heard of the Gallup poll, right?
Yeah.
This is where it's from.
For publication, a continuous record of the nation's approval or disapproval of how the country is being run.
Gallup and Roper rejected Bernays' view that human beings were at the mercy of unconscious forces and so needed to be controlled. Their system of opinion polling was based on the idea that people could be trusted to know what they wanted. They argued that one could measure and predict the opinions and behaviour of the public if one asked strictly factual questions and avoided manipulating their emotions.
Well, how about this one? Do you think Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal has been bad for the nation in general?
No, that question's loaded. It automatically suggests an answer.
Well, how about this? Is your present feeling toward President Roosevelt one of general approval or general disapproval?
That's better.
Prior to scientific polling, the view of many people was that you couldn't trust public opinion, it was irrational, that it was ill-informed, chaotic, unruly, and so forth, and so that opinion should be dismissed. But with scientific polling, I think it established very clearly that people are rational, that they do make good decisions, and this offers democracy a chance to be truly informed by the public, giving everybody a voice in the way the country is run. I know my father wouldn't necessarily say the voice of the public is the voice of God, but he did feel very much that the voice of the people is a rational voice and should be heard.
What Roosevelt was doing was forging a new connection between the masses and politicians. No longer were they irrational consumers who were managed by sating their desires. Instead, they were sensible citizens who could take part in the governing of the country. In 1936, Roosevelt stood for re-election. He promised further control over big business. To the corporations, it was the beginning of a dictatorship.
Roosevelt interferes with private enterprise, and is running the country into debt for generations to come. The way to get recovery is to let business alone.
But Roosevelt was triumphantly re-elected.
It looks, my friends, like a real landslide this time. So please let me thank you again and tell you that I hope to see you all very soon and bid you an affectionate good night.
Faced with this, business now decided to fight back, to regain power in America. At the heart of the battle would be Edward Bernays and the profession he had invented, public relations.
Following that election, business people start to get together and start to carry on discussions, primarily in private, and they start talking to each other about the need to sort of carry on ideological warfare against the New Deal and to sort of reassert the sort of connectedness between the idea of democracy on the one hand and the idea of privately owned business on the other. And so, under the umbrella of an organization which still exists, which is called the National Association of Manufacturers, and whose membership included all of the major corporations of the United States, a campaign is launched explicitly designed to create emotional attachments between the public and big business. It's Bernays' techniques being used on a grand scale. I mean, totally.
The General Motors Parade of Progress, traveling the high roads and byroads of America, bringing to millions of Americans in their own hometown the fascinating story behind modern industry, showing
the campaign set out to show dramatically that it was business, not politicians, who had created modern America.
a better mode of living for all of us.
Bernays was an advisor to General Motors, but he was no longer alone. The industry he had founded now flourished as hundreds of public relations advisors organized a vast campaign. They not only used advertisements and billboards, but managed to insinuate their message into the editorial pages of the newspapers. It became a bitter fight. In response to the campaign, the government made films that warned of the unscrupulous manipulation of the press by big business. And the central villain was the new figure of the public relations man.
They tried to achieve their ends by working entirely behind the scenes, corrupting and deceiving the public. The aims of such groups may be either good or bad, so far as the public interest is concerned, but their methods are a grave danger to democratic institutions.
The films also showed how the responsible citizen could monitor the press themselves. They could create a chart that analysed the reporting for signs of hidden bias. But such earnest instruction was to be no match for the powerful imagination of Edward Bernays. He was about to help create a vision of the utopia that free market capitalism would build in America if it was unleashed. In 1939, New York hosted the World's Fair. Edward Bernays was a central advisor. He insisted that the theme be the link between democracy and American business. At the heart of the fair was a giant white dome that Bernays named Democracity. And the central exhibit was a vast working model of America's future, constructed by the General Motors Corporation.
To my father, the World's Fair was an opportunity
That's crazy.
to keep the status quo, that is, capitalism in a democracy. Democracy and capitalism, that marriage, right, linking, just like that. He did that by manipulating people and getting them to think that you couldn't have real democracy in anything but a capitalist society, which was capable of doing anything, of creating these wonderful highways, of making, moving pictures inside everybody's house, of telephones that didn't need cords, of sleek roadsters. I mean, it was consumerist, but at the same time, you inferred that in a funny way, democracy and capitalism went together.
The World's Fair was an extraordinary success and captured America's imagination. The vision it portrayed was of a new form of democracy, in which business responded to people's innermost desires in a way politicians could never do. But it was a form of democracy that depended on treating people not as active citizens as Roosevelt did, but as passive consumers. Because this, Bernays believed, was the key to control in a mass democracy.
It's not that the people are in charge, but that the people's desires are in charge. The people are not in charge. The people exercise no decision-making power within this environment. So democracy is reduced from something which assumes an active citizenry to the idea of the public as passive consumers. Driven primarily by instinctual or unconscious desires, and that if you can in fact trigger those needs and desires, you can get what you want from them.
But this struggle between the two views of human beings as to whether they were rational or irrational was about to be dramatically affected by events in Europe. Events that would also change the fortunes of the Freud family. In March 1938, the Nazis annexed Austria. It was called the Anschluss. Hitler arrived in Vienna to an extraordinary outpouring of mass adulation. But even as he drove through the city, behind the scenes, the Nazis were systematically whipping up and unleashing the hatred of the crowd against the enemies of the new Greater Germany.
The Anschluss was a kind of explosion of terrible hatred against the enemies, the so-called enemies, or whatever they considered enemies, against the Jews totally, and also against a lot of very distant Austrians who had opposed the Nazis in Austria. They said it's legitimate, now you can do what you want, so they did it. Stealing, robbing and killing, I can't say it otherwise. And human depravity, of course, is always very near to normal behavior. It can change very quickly.
As the violence and assassinations raged in Vienna, Freud decided he had to leave. His aim was to go to Britain, but he knew that Britain, like many countries, was refusing entry to most Jewish refugees. But help came from the leading psychoanalyst in Britain, Ernest Jones. He was in the same ice skating club as the Home Secretary, Sir Samuel Hoare, and Jones persuaded Hoare to issue Freud a British work permit. And in May 1938, Freud, his daughter Anna, and other members of his family set off for London. Freud arrived in London as Britain was preparing for war, and he settled with his daughter Anna in a house in Hampstead. But Freud's cancer was now far advanced, and in September 1939, just 3 weeks after the outbreak of war, he died. The Second World War would utterly transform the way governments saw democracy and the people they governed. Next week's programme will show how the American government, as a result of the war, became convinced there were savage, dangerous forces hidden inside all human beings, forces that needed to be controlled. The terrible
You can see how there was a lot more involved happening, both politically, philosophically, psychologically, prior to just World War II, right? They were
Yeah.
literally at mass scales, at the meta level. The elite around the world were aware of these intellectual or rational ways of systematizing both society and progress. All right.
Yeah.
So we haven't even gotten to 1960 yet. 1960 is when the Second Vatican Council and the Catholic Church happens. So the popes were very aware of this. The church was also very aware of this.
And they weaponized it.
No, yeah. But in order to see how not just the church, but also society weaponizes it, we have to see what happens after World War II.
Yeah.
So we have on one side, right? They kind of embellish it a little bit, but FDR, right? He decides that the government itself has to get involved in driving progress. Okay? So even though he's using he consults Gallup to try to come up with a Gallup poll, it embellishes it because fundamentally both big business and FDR government, they're both what they actually agree on is that the public itself cannot be trusted to determine what their future should be. But in
Yeah.
FDR's case, he's created a focus group and the Gallup poll to try to ask them generalized questions through this other third-party organization. He's not going to use advertising or emotional manipulation in order to get the feedback that he wants. He's going to ask them fact-based questions, and as a focus group, to take a temperature, right, for what the government can get away with. That's really what it is. The reason why I'm saying they embellish it a little bit is because people who are in politics and in government, at the end of the day, they're the decision maker. So there's no way of giving an account, even if they were going to get like feedback from the public where it's at right now and what the temperature is. The public is never has a seat at the table in the first place once they vote the person into office. It doesn't mean that the government is not involved in big business, because now the government through the New Deal is the one that's giving contracts out to big business. This takes profit, so it's a matter of who's going to profit. Is the government going to get a bigger pie, or is big business going to get more bigger of the pie? So it kind of became like this factionalism between like the different ideologues, or the oligarchs, for those people that were controlling the government at the time. So you're going to see how this like flips, as we kind of like move through the decades, because then you're going to get you're going to see how FDR democracy evolves after World War II. I just wanted to clarify that what both big business at this particular time and FDR do agree on is that they are not going to be able to trust the populace to make decisions about how the country as a whole is going to progress anymore. So just like in Nazi Germany, they took that power away from people and says, if we want to move forward industrially, then there has to be some sort of directing of this industrialization. We're not just dealing with individual people and the kind of deals that they can make. We're dealing with massive groups of people and mass production of goods. So from Edward Bernays' side, that's their crux of the argument, and big business side, that's their big argument, is that the whole Gallup poll is just a canard, because ultimately the people don't have a choice anyways. So I'm just laying out that's kind of like their justification of what motivates them. So then they're like, well, let's provide them like a better vision or a better dream about America.